The sun was just beginning to set over the quiet park, casting a golden glow over the children playing and families gathering after a long day. Among them was Jamal, an energetic and curious 12-year-old boy who had come to the park with his friends to enjoy an evening of basketball and laughter. His favorite part of the park was the large oak tree near the basketball court, where he often hung his backpack and occasionally took a break to watch others play. It was his happy place, a space where he felt free, safe, and just like any other kid. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the park would become the setting for an incident that would not only shake Jamal's world, but also spark conversations and questions far beyond his quiet neighborhood. As Jamal dribbled his ball on the court, a police car pulled into the parking lot. The flashing lights weren't unusual around the area. Most people had grown used to officers patrolling nearby. However, this time was different. The officer who stepped out seemed tense, scanning the park with sharp, almost suspicious eyes. Jamal, like many kids his age, had been taught to respect authority. But he also carried the weight of quiet lessons from his parents. Be careful, stay polite, and most importantly, stay safe. Those words echoed in his mind as he noticed the officer's gaze lingering on him a little too long. He tried to shake it off, focusing instead on his game. Suddenly, a bark pierced the air, sharp and aggressive. The officer had brought a police dog, a large, muscular German shepherd that seemed restless, its handler holding the leash tightly. The officer began walking toward the court, his eyes narrowing on Jamal. A chill ran down the boy's spine as the officer's voice boomed across the park. "Hey, you! Stop right there." Jamal froze. His friends turned to look, unsure of what was happening. "Me?" Jamal asked hesitantly, his voice trembling slightly. "Yes, you. Come here." The other kids scattered, their instinctive fear taking over. Jamal hesitated, unsure of what to do. He looked around for an adult, someone to help or at least witness what was happening, but everyone seemed frozen in place, watching from a distance. The officer moved closer, his hand tightening on the dog's leash. The German shepherd barked again, louder this time, baring its teeth. Jamal took a step back, his heart racing. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't move," the officer commanded, his tone sharp and unyielding. Fear gripped Jamal. He had no idea why he was being singled out, but every instinct told him this wasn't going to end well. He thought about his dad, a man he admired deeply, a man who had always told him that justice and fairness were the backbone of society. His dad, Captain Davis, was a respected officer in a neighboring district. Jamal wished, more than anything, that his dad was there right now. The officer's voice cut through his thoughts. "Get on the ground," he ordered, releasing the leash slightly. The dog lunged forward, barking ferociously, its teeth snapping dangerously close to Jamal. Panic set in. Jamal didn't know what to do. He raised his hands slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. "Please," he begged, "I didn't do anything." The tension in the park was palpable. Parents watched helplessly, unsure if stepping in would make things worse. The officer, seemingly undeterred by the growing crowd, gestured to the dog again. "I said, get down." And then, as if fate had intervened, a voice rang out, a voice so commanding and authoritative that it seemed to stop time. "What's going on here?" All eyes turned to see a tall man in a crisp, dark suit walking toward the scene. His badge glinted under the streetlights, and his presence radiated authority. It was Captain Davis, Jamal's father. Unaware of the connection, the officer turned toward him, irritation flashing across his face. "This kid was being uncooperative," he began, but Captain Davis didn't let him finish. "That's my son," he said firmly, his voice steady but laced with unmistakable anger. The officer froze, his expression shifting from confidence to unease. The crowd murmured, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Captain Davis stepped between his son and the officer, his eyes locked on the dog still growling at Jamal. "Stand down. Now." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The power dynamics had shifted in an instant, and the situation was far from over. And that's where the story begins. An incident that would uncover hidden prejudices, challenge authority, and leave a community grappling with the question, what happens when those meant to protect us fall short? The park fell into an uneasy silence as Captain Davis stood between Jamal and the officer. The dog was still growling, its handler frozen in place, unsure of how to respond to the sudden shift in authority. Jamal, his hands trembling, took a small step back, his tear-streaked face staring at his father. Relief washed over him, but it was mixed with fear and confusion. Why had this happened? What had he done to deserve such treatment? The officer finally tightened his grip on the leash, pulling the dog back a few steps. His hesitation was clear. "Sir, I didn't realize," he started, but Captain Davis cut him off. "You didn't realize what?" Davis's voice was calm but cold, each word landing with precision, his eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto the officer's. "You didn't realize that you're pointing a trained attack dog at a child. Or you didn't realize that child happens to be my son." The officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the crowd that had gathered. People were filming with their phones now, capturing every second of the confrontation. Some whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of shock and outrage. Jamal's knees felt weak as he watched his father. He had always admired Captain Davis's composure, the way he could command respect without raising his voice. But tonight, there was something different, a raw edge to his tone that Jamal had never heard before. It scared him, but it also made him feel safe, knowing his dad was there to protect him. "I was responding to a report," the officer finally said, his voice defensive but shaky. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the area." "And your response was to target the first black boy you saw?" Davis asked, his words cutting like a blade. The officer opened his mouth to protest, but Davis didn't give him the chance. "Let me make one thing very clear. My son is not a suspect. He's a child. A 12-year-old boy playing basketball in the park. You don't get to treat him, or anyone else, like this." Jamal's heart swelled with pride, but it was quickly followed by a deep sadness. He had heard stories like this before, stories his parents shared with him about the realities of being black in America. But he never thought he'd be the one living it, especially not with his dad being a police captain. The officer, clearly flustered, tried to regain control of the situation. "I was just following protocol," he muttered. "The dog was under control." "Was he?" Davis shot back, his gaze flicking to the German shepherd, whose teeth were still bared. "Because it didn't look like that to me." The tension in the air was unbearable. Jamal looked around, noticing the crowd had grown. Some people nodded in agreement with his father, while others simply watched, their faces a mixture of disbelief and concern. He could hear murmurs. "This is unacceptable. Why was the kid targeted? Good thing his dad showed up." But not everyone looked supportive. A few people exchanged skeptical glances, as if trying to justify the officer's actions. Jamal caught snippets of their conversations. Maybe the kid did something. Cops don't just act like that for no reason. Jamal's stomach churned. He wanted to scream, to tell them he hadn't done anything, but his voice felt trapped in his throat. Instead, he clung to the hope that his father would set everything right. As if reading Jamal's thoughts, Davis turned to him, his expression softening for a moment. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Jamal nodded, though his legs felt like jelly and his heart was still racing. "I didn't do anything, Dad," he whispered. "I know, son," Davis said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong." The officer shifted again, glancing nervously at the people filming. He seemed to realize he was quickly losing control of the narrative. "Look, Captain, maybe we should talk about this privately," he suggested, lowering his voice. "Privately?" Davis repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You didn't handle this privately when you humiliated my son in front of all these people. Now you want privacy." The crowd murmured in agreement. Jamal noticed more phones pointed in their direction, and he felt a mix of embarrassment and vindication. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and he didn't like it. But at the same time, he wanted everyone to see what had happened. Maybe then they'd understand. Another voice broke through the crowd, this time a woman in her 40s with a determined expression. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," she said, stepping forward. "My nephew was harassed by police in this same park a few months ago. Nothing came of it." Her words sparked more murmurs. Others chimed in, sharing similar stories, each one painting a troubling picture of a pattern that couldn't be ignored. The officer's face grew redder with each passing second. He glanced around, clearly overwhelmed by the mounting pressure. "I think we're done here," he muttered, tugging the dog's leash as he began to retreat. But Captain Davis wasn't done. "You don't get to just walk away," he said, his voice like steel. "There will be accountability for this. You'll be hearing from me, and trust me, this isn't going to be swept under the rug." The officer didn't respond. He hurried back to his car, the dog trotting beside him, its growls finally subdued. The tension eased slightly as the flashing lights disappeared into the distance, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Jamal looked up at his father, his voice small. "Why did he do that, Dad?" Davis knelt down, so they were eye level. He placed both hands on Jamal's shoulders, his expression soft but serious. "Sometimes, people let fear and bias control their actions," he said carefully. "It's wrong, and it's unfair, but it happens. That's why we have to stand up for what's right and make sure people like that officer are held accountable." Jamal nodded slowly, though his mind swirled with questions. He felt anger, confusion, and a lingering sense of injustice, but he also felt a spark of something else. Hope. Hope that his dad's words weren't just promises, that something good could come from this horrible experience. The crowd began to disperse, though a few people approached Captain Davis to thank him or express their support. Jamal stayed close to his father, feeling a little safer now but still shaken. As they walked toward their car, Jamal glanced back at the park. It looked different to him now, like a place that had lost some of its magic. But as he turned his attention back to his dad, he felt a flicker of determination. Maybe this wasn't the end of the story. Maybe it was just the beginning. Captain Davis drove home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Jamal sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. The night was quiet now, but inside the car, an invisible weight pressed down on both of them. Jamal couldn't shake the image of the officer's face or the sound of the dog's growl. It played over and over in his mind, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. "Dad," Jamal said softly, breaking the silence. "Do you think he would have let the dog bite me?" Davis exhaled slowly, his knuckles whitening as he tightened his grip. "I don't know, son," he admitted. "But what I do know is that he had no right to put you in that position. None." Jamal nodded but didn't say anything else. He wasn't sure what he wanted to hear, but his dad's answer only left him with more questions. He thought about his dad's job and how proud he was of him. Captain Davis wasn't just a police officer. He was a man people looked up to, someone who believed in justice and fairness. But tonight made Jamal wonder, how much could even someone like his dad really change? When they got home, Jamal's mom, Teresa, was waiting for them at the door. One look at her husband's face, and she knew something had happened. "What's wrong?" she asked, her eyes darting to Jamal. "What happened?" Before Davis could answer, Jamal blurted out, "A cop almost let his dog attack me." Teresa froze, her face a mix of shock and anger. "What? Are you serious?" she asked, pulling Jamal into a tight hug. "Are you okay, baby?" "I'm fine," Jamal mumbled, though his voice wavered. Dad stopped him. Teresa's eyes flicked to Davis, and he gave her a small nod. "We'll talk about it," he said quietly. "Let's get him settled first." Jamal went upstairs to his room, leaving his parents in the living room. He could hear their voices downstairs, low and tense, as they talked about what had happened. He sat on his bed, his basketball still in his hands, and stared at the wall. Downstairs, Teresa paced the room, her anger bubbling over. How could something like this happen? Jamal's just a kid, she said, her voice trembling. Davis ran a hand over his face, exhaustion evident in his posture. Because to that officer, he wasn't just a kid. He was a threat. That's the problem. Teresa stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. You're going to report this, right? He needs to face consequences for what he did. Of course I'm going to report it, Davis said. But you know how these things go, Teresa. It's not always as simple as it should be. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try, she shot back. You're a captain, Marcus. If anyone can make them listen, it's you. Davis nodded, though he didn't look convinced. He knew the system better than most, and he knew how easily incidents like this could be dismissed or downplayed. But this was different. This was his son. The next day, Davis went into work early. He filed a formal complaint against the officer and requested an internal investigation. But as he handed over the paperwork, he could feel the skepticism in the room. His colleagues, many of whom he considered friends, avoided meeting his eyes. Are you sure you want to push this, Marcus? One of them asked quietly. It could stir up a lot of trouble. It's already stirred up, Davis replied firmly. I'm not letting this slide. Meanwhile, word of the incident spread quickly. Videos of the confrontation in the park were uploaded online, and the story began gaining attention. Comments flooded in, some supportive, others dismissive. This is exactly why we need police reform, one person wrote. People need to stop playing the victim, another countered. The kid was probably acting suspicious. At school, Jamal found himself at the center of unwanted attention. Some kids whispered behind his back, while others asked him outright what had happened. Is it true a cop almost sixed a dog on you? One boy asked during lunch. Jamal nodded, feeling the heat rise to his face. He didn't like talking about it, but the questions kept coming. Man, that's crazy, another kid said. I would have been so scared. I was scared, Jamal admitted, though he kept his voice low. Not everyone was sympathetic. A few kids laughed, saying things like, maybe you shouldn't have been in the park at night. Jamal clenched his fists, frustration and embarrassment boiling inside him. He wanted to shout at them, to make them understand, but he didn't know how. Instead, he kept his head down and tried to ignore the comments. That evening, Davis came home with an update. The officer's been put on administrative leave, he told Teresa. That's a start, she said, though her tone was cautious. But it's not enough. It's never enough, Davis replied, his voice heavy. Jamal overheard their conversation from the stairs. He wanted to believe his dad could fix this, but deep down, he felt like the damage had already been done. The park didn't feel safe anymore, and for the first time, he started to wonder if it ever really had been. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Davis met with community leaders, activists, and fellow officers, trying to address the broader issues the incident had brought to light. Teresa organized a neighborhood meeting to give people a space to share their concerns and experiences. Jamal, meanwhile, struggled to find his footing. He didn't know how to process what had happened or how to move forward. But as he listened to his parents talk about making changes and holding people accountable, he began to see that maybe he had a role to play too. The conflict wasn't over. In many ways, it felt like it was just beginning. But Jamal knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone. His family, his community, they were all in this together. And that gave him a glimmer of hope, even in the face of uncertainty. The community meeting Teresa organized was packed. People filled the small room, their faces serious, their voices a low hum of conversations overlapping one another. Jamal sat in the corner, his knees pulled up to his chest, watching as his mom stood at the front, her presence commanding. She didn't usually take the lead in situations like this, but tonight was different. This wasn't just about Jamal. It was about all the kids in their community, about the fear and anger so many parents carried with them every time their children stepped outside. I know many of you are angry, Teresa began, her voice calm but firm. "And you have every right to be. What happened to Jamal could have happened to any of our kids. But we can't just let this go. We need to push for real change." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. A man in his 50s stood up, his face lined with frustration. "We've been talking about change for years," he said, "but nothing ever really happens. How do we know this time will be any different?" Teresa didn't hesitate. "Because this time we have proof," she said. "The videos, the witnesses, people saw what happened, and they're paying attention. We can't let them look away." Jamal shifted in his seat, feeling a strange mix of pride and guilt. He didn't want to be the reason his mom was up there, fighting so hard. But at the same time, he felt like maybe this was bigger than just him. As the meeting went on, more people shared their stories. Neighbors who had experienced similar incidents, parents who had warned their kids to be extra careful around police, teens who spoke about the fear they carried every day. Jamal listened, his chest tightening with every word. He realized this wasn't just his story, it was part of something much larger. Meanwhile, Captain Davis was facing pressure of his own. The internal investigation was moving slowly, too slowly for his liking. Every time he asked for an update, he got the same answer: "It's being handled." But Davis wasn't convinced. He knew how easily these things could be buried under red tape and bureaucracy. One afternoon, he was called into a meeting with his superior, Chief Reynolds. The chief was a seasoned officer, his face lined with years of experience, but there was a cautiousness in his demeanor that put Davis on edge. "Marcus," Reynolds began, folding his hands on the desk, "I wanted to talk to you about this complaint you filed." Davis nodded, his expression neutral. "What about it?" Reynolds hesitated. "Look, I understand your position. I really do. But this situation is complicated. The officer in question has a clean record, and some of his colleagues are saying he was just doing his job." "Doing his job," Davis repeated, his voice sharp. "His job is to protect and serve, not to terrorize a child." "I'm not saying what happened was right," Reynolds said quickly. "But we have to consider all angles here. These things aren't always black and white." Davis leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "With all due respect, Chief, this isn't about gray areas. This is about accountability. If we can't hold ourselves to the standards we're supposed to uphold, then what are we even doing here?" Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm just saying, tread carefully, Marcus. You've got a good reputation, and I'd hate to see you jeopardize it over something like this." Davis clenched his jaw, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "Something like this?" he repeated, his voice low. "This is my son we're talking about. My family. If you think I'm going to back down because it's inconvenient, then you don't know me at all." The tension in the room was palpable. Reynolds didn't respond right away, and Davis didn't wait for him to. He stood up, straightening his uniform. "If the department won't take this seriously, then I'll find someone who will," he said before walking out. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and mounting tension. The story had gained traction online, with news outlets picking it up and amplifying the conversation. People from all over the city were weighing in, some offering support, others defending the officer. Jamal, meanwhile, tried to go about his routine, but it was impossible to ignore the whispers and stares. At basketball practice, one of his teammates, a boy named Ryan, approached him. "Hey man," Ryan said, his voice hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I saw the video. That was messed up." Jamal shrugged, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, it was." "I don't get why they always think we're up to something," Ryan continued, shaking his head. "Like, we're just kids, you know." Jamal nodded, his throat tightening. "Yeah," he said quietly. That night, as Jamal sat in his room, he found himself scrolling through the comments on one of the videos. Some of them were supportive, but others were cruel, blaming him for what had happened or questioning his dad's actions. "Maybe the kid should have just listened," one comment read. "Typical. Always playing the victim," another said. Jamal's chest tightened, anger and frustration bubbling inside him. He wanted to scream at these strangers, to make them see the truth, but he knew it wouldn't matter. They'd already made up their minds. Downstairs, Davis and Teresa were sitting at the kitchen table, their voices low but urgent. They were planning their next steps, trying to figure out how to keep the momentum going. "The press wants an interview," Teresa said, scrolling through her phone. "They think it'll help." Davis frowned. "I don't want Jamal to feel like we're putting him on display," he said. "I know," Teresa replied, "but this isn't just about him anymore. People need to see what's really happening." Davis sighed, running a hand over his face. "I just want to protect him," he said quietly. Teresa reached out, placing a hand over his. "You are," she said, "but protecting him means making sure this doesn't happen again, to him or anyone else." Upstairs, Jamal stared at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He didn't know what the future held, but he could feel it building, like the calm before a storm. And for the first time, he wondered if he was ready for what was coming. The next morning, he told his parents what he had seen. Davis' expression darkened, and Teresa's hands tightened around her coffee mug. "Did you recognize them?" Davis asked. Jamal shook his head. "No, but they didn't seem like they were just passing by." Davis nodded, his jaw clenching. "I'll look into it," he said, though his tone betrayed his frustration. He already felt like he was fighting an uphill battle, and now it seemed like someone was trying to intimidate them. Later that day, Davis called one of his trusted colleagues, Detective Harris, to discuss what Jamal had seen. Harris had been a friend for years, someone Davis knew he could rely on. When Davis explained the situation, Harris didn't hesitate. "I'll check out the area," Harris said. "See if any neighbors have security cameras that might have picked something up." While Davis focused on uncovering who might have been outside their house, Teresa threw herself into organizing another community event. This time, it was a march to demand accountability and better training for officers. The momentum from the first meeting was still strong, and more people were stepping up to help. Jamal, however, felt torn. He wanted to be involved, to support his parents and the cause they were fighting for, but he also felt the weight of the attention on him. At school, the whispers had turned into outright conversations, and even some of his teachers seemed to treat him differently. During history class, his teacher, Mr. Bennett, paused mid-lesson and addressed him directly. "Jamal, I imagine you have some thoughts on this topic," he said, gesturing to the discussion about civil rights movements. The room fell silent, all eyes on Jamal. He felt his face heat up as he struggled to find the right words. Yeah, I guess," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Bennett smiled, clearly trying to encourage him. "It's okay, take your time," he said. Jamal glanced around the room, the pressure building. Finally, he managed to say, "I think it's important to speak up, even when it's hard." The teacher nodded, and a few students murmured their agreement, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was being put on display. He spent the rest of the day avoiding eye contact with everyone. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Davis's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Harris," he said, standing up to take the call. Teresa and Jamal exchanged a worried look as Davis stepped into the other room. When he returned a few minutes later, his expression was grim. "Harris found something," he said, sitting down heavily. "One of the neighbors has a camera that caught the people Jamal saw. They were leaving something in the mailbox." Teresa's brow furrowed. "What did they leave?" Davis hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "A note. It didn't have a name, but the message was clear. Back off." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Jamal's stomach twisted, and Teresa's face hardened. "What are we supposed to do with that?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger. "We're not backing off," Davis said firmly. "If anything, this just proves we're doing the right thing." But Jamal wasn't so sure. He didn't say it out loud, but the idea that someone was watching them, leaving threatening messages, made him feel small and helpless. He wondered if speaking up was worth all of this. The next day, the march went ahead as planned. Hundreds of people showed up, carrying signs and chanting for justice. The energy was electric, but there was also an undercurrent of tension. Davis couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As the march wound through the streets, Davis spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Officer Taylor, the man who had been at the center of the incident in the park. Taylor wasn't in uniform, but his presence was unmistakable. He stood on the sidewalk, watching silently as the march passed by. Davis's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He made a note of Taylor's position and kept walking, his eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. When the march ended, Davis pulled Harris aside and told him about seeing Taylor. "You think he's trying to send a message?" Harris asked. "I wouldn't put it past him," Davis replied, "but I don't have any proof." Harris nodded. "I'll keep an eye on him," he said. "In the meantime, watch your back." The warning didn't do much to ease Davis' mind. He could feel the pressure mounting, the stakes rising with every passing day. And as much as he wanted to believe they were making progress, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was still ahead. The day of the final hearing had arrived. The tension in the air was palpable as the small community center filled with concerned citizens, media, and a handful of law enforcement officers. The pressure on Captain Davis had never been greater. Today was supposed to be the culmination of everything they had been working toward: justice for Jamal, accountability for Officer Taylor, and a chance to show that the system could still be trusted. Jamal stood near the back of the room, watching his father as he prepared to speak. His dad looked calm on the outside, but Jamal could see the wariness in his eyes. The weeks of back and forth with internal affairs, the mounting threats, and the weight of leading the charge in a case that seemed to carry so many layers of complexity had taken their toll. Still, Davis stood tall, his presence commanding the room as he took the podium. The moment the meeting began, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just a hearing, it was a battlefield. The debate between the opposing sides was fierce, with one camp demanding accountability and the other trying to defend the actions of Officer Taylor. Some suggested it was just an unfortunate misunderstanding, but the officer had acted within the confines of his training. But every time someone tried to downplay what had happened in the park, the room erupted in outrage. Davis took the microphone, his voice steady but full of purpose. "I'm here today, not just as a captain, but as a father," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "I spent my whole life trying to make this city a better place for my children and all children. But what happened that night, when my son was nearly attacked, wasn't just wrong. It was a wake-up call for all of us." Jamal, watching from behind the crowd, felt a surge of emotion. This was his dad at his finest. His heart swelled with pride as Davis continued, pressing for real change. But even as the words flowed from his father's mouth, Jamal couldn't escape the feeling of eyes watching them, waiting for something to go wrong. Then, as the hearing progressed and the discussion became more heated, something unexpected happened. Just as the panel was about to make their final statements, a security guard entered the room, holding a piece of paper. The man approached the stage and handed it to one of the moderators. The entire room fell silent as the moderator cleared his throat and read the contents aloud. "Attention, everyone. We have just received an anonymous tip. This may change everything." Jamal's stomach dropped. The audience murmured, and Davis, who had been standing firm, immediately turned to the moderator, his expression one of concern. "What is this?" he asked. The moderator unfolded the paper and read aloud. Officer Taylor's involvement in the incident at the park was not a mistake. He was specifically ordered to engage with the boy that night by a higher-up. Officer Taylor is not the only one who needs to be held accountable. The room exploded in chaos. Gasps of disbelief filled the air, and people began shouting. Jamal's mind raced as he tried to process what had just been revealed. Someone somewhere had been behind Officer Taylor's actions, someone in a higher position of power, someone who had orchestrated the entire event. Davis's face turned pale as the implications hit him. His mind began to piece together the puzzle: the officer's strange behavior, the threats against their family, the subtle hints of corruption within the department. This was no longer just about one rogue officer. This went deeper, much deeper than anyone had anticipated. The moderator quickly called for order, but Davis had already stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Who is this tip from?" he demanded. "Who can confirm this?" But the answer came too late. Before anyone could respond, a sudden bang echoed through the building. A window shattered, sending glass cascading across the floor. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hall as people screamed and ducked under the tables. Davis immediately sprang into action, pushing Jamal to the ground and covering him with his own body. The chaos unfolded in slow motion. The crowd scattered, and a figure darted out of the room, disappearing into the back hall. Security guards rushed in, and the building became an uproar of sirens and frantic commands. But it was clear. Something had just shifted dramatically. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. It had reached a level where powerful people were willing to stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, his body frozen under his father's weight. His mind raced, who had just tried to silence them? Who had so much to lose that they were willing to risk everything? And why was his family at the center of it all? As the situation settled and the authorities rushed to investigate the source of the attack, a new wave of realization hit Jamal. His family wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. They were now entangled in something much bigger, something that threatened everything they stood for. Someone somewhere wanted this story buried. They didn't want the truth to come out. Davis pulled himself up, helping Jamal to his feet. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice urgent. But before they could leave, the room went dark. The lights flickered out and a voice, distorted and barely audible, came through the loudspeakers. "If you want the truth," the voice said, "you'll have to find it for yourselves. This is far from over." The power cut off, and the room was plunged into darkness. Screams echoed through the hall, and people stumbled, trying to find their way out. The police and security were now everywhere, their flashlights slicing through the dark, but there was no sign of the mysterious figure who had thrown the bomb. The tension was thick, and no one knew who could be trusted anymore. The only thing that was clear was that the story had taken a dark turn, and they were all caught in the middle of something that was far from finished. As Jamal and Davis were escorted out of the building, his father's grip tightened on his shoulder. "Stay close," Davis murmured, but Jamal's mind was already racing ahead. The truth was out there, hidden, buried, and protected by forces they hadn't even begun to understand. This fight wasn't over. It had just taken an even more dangerous turn. The days following the blackout at the community center were a blur of investigation, questions, and more threats. Captain Davis, Jamal, and Teresa could feel the pressure mounting from every direction. The tip about Officer Taylor being just a pawn in a much bigger game had sent shockwaves through the police department, but it had also made them a target. Despite the chaos, Davis knew they couldn't back down, not now. The investigation into the attack at the hearing only deepened the mystery. Security footage from the building showed no clear suspects, and no one seemed willing to come forward with any answers. The anonymous tip had been a game-changer, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Who was behind the conspiracy? Who had ordered the attack on Jamal and why? Davis worked tirelessly, following every lead and refusing to let the story fade away. He had seen corruption in the system before, but this was different. He was no longer just fighting for justice for his son. He was fighting to expose the truth and hold those in power accountable, no matter how high up they went. But the danger was real. The weeks after the hearing were filled with more threats, strange phone calls, anonymous letters, and even strange vehicles parked outside their house at odd hours. Jamal and Teresa were no longer able to ignore the gravity of the situation. They were being watched, and the stakes had never been higher. It wasn't until a month later that the breakthrough came. Detective Harris had been quietly gathering evidence on Officer Taylor and his connections within the department. Harris had always been a friend to Davis, but now he was putting his career on the line to help them uncover the truth. One evening, as Davis sat with Teresa in the kitchen, His phone buzzed with a message from Harris. His heart skipped a beat as he read the words. "I've got something. Meet me at the station in 30 minutes. We need to talk." Davis didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and motioned for Teresa to stay behind. "I'll be back soon," he said, kissing her forehead before rushing out the door. When Davis arrived at the station, Harris was waiting for him in a small, dimly lit office. The detective didn't waste any time. "You're not going to like this," Harris said, handing Davis a folder. Davis opened it and began scanning through the documents, his eyes widening as he took in the details. The evidence was clear. Officer Taylor had been working with several other officers, high-ranking ones who had been in the department for decades. They had been orchestrating illegal activities, including planting evidence, covering up police brutality, and using their positions of power to intimidate the community. But that wasn't the worst part. What really struck Davis was the connection between these officers and several high-profile figures in the city's government. It was bigger than just one officer. It was a network of corruption that had spread through the very institutions that were supposed to protect the people. And Jamal had become a pawn in their game because he had dared to stand up. Davis clenched his fists as he absorbed the gravity of what this meant. It wasn't just about Officer Taylor anymore. It was about cleaning house, exposing the corruption that had festered for years, maybe even decades. They couldn't back down now. But before Davis could speak, Harris dropped another bombshell. "You're not the only one fighting this," Harris said. "There are others, officers who have been keeping quiet, but they want to bring this all down. They just need someone to lead the charge." Davis's mind raced. This was what he had been waiting for, the chance to take down the corrupt system from the inside. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but with the right support, it was possible. "Then we go public," Davis said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We take this to the people. Let them know what's been happening in their own backyard. They need to know the truth." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. With Harris's help, Davis and his allies gathered everything they could: photographs, recordings, testimonies. It was all carefully planned and compiled. The pieces were falling into place, but they knew the risks. Once the information went public, there would be no turning back. The people they were up against had power, real power, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. When the day came, Davis held a press conference that would change everything. It was held in the same community center where the initial hearing had erupted into chaos. The room was packed with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Davis stepped up to the podium, his eyes scanning the room. He knew what he was about to say would put everything on the line, but it was time. "We've been lied to," Davis began, his voice echoing in the silent room. "For too long, we've allowed corruption to thrive within our own police department. I stand before you not just as a captain, but as a father, a citizen, and someone who believes in the promise of justice. My son Jamal became a target because he dared to speak up against an unjust system. And now, we will make sure that no more families suffer because of the lies we've been fed." The room was dead silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Davis continued, revealing the damning evidence, photos, documents, and recordings that exposed the full extent of the corruption. The truth was out, and the city had no choice but to confront it. The fallout was swift. Officers involved in the conspiracy were suspended, investigated, and in some cases arrested. High-ranking officials who had turned a blind eye to the corruption were forced to resign. The city was in upheaval, but there was also a sense of hope, a sense that change was finally possible. As for Davis and his family, the fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done, and they knew they had made powerful enemies. But they had also gained the support of the community. They were no longer alone in their battle. The days that followed brought both relief and new challenges. The public demanded accountability, and Davis found himself at the forefront of a movement for reform. Jamal, though still affected by the trauma he had endured, felt a sense of pride that his family had been part of something bigger than themselves. As they stood together, Watching the city take its first steps toward change, Davis turned to his son. "We did this together," he said quietly, his voice filled with both exhaustion and resolve. Jamal nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, we did." And for the first time in weeks, Jamal felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The fight wasn't over, but they had won a major battle, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that real change was possible.